Hello, everyone, and welcome to back to the online test conf. Obviously, day one session. I lost count. One, two, three, four. I think, unless I'm mistaken, of today. We have with us Yevheniia. Oh God, you'll need to help me with that. Hlovatska.
It's not a big deal. Yeah, you're right.
Okay, we have Yevheniia with us. Yevheniia is a QA guild leader at Wix. She's also an agile testing instructor and something that actually sounds pretty amazing, a global ambassador for the Women in Tech Network, which it would be great if you can explain. But more importantly, I think that you're going to share with us a secret that I'm personally looking forward to learn on how to make developers love creating end-to-end testing scenarios. And I'm really looking forward to learning from you, really, sincerely, because it's a challenge also for myself. And that's it. The floor is absolutely yours. I just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions, go ahead and use the Q&A channel, and hopefully we will have some time towards the end. So, Evgenia, go for it.
Okay, cool. Thanks a lot for introducing me.
By the way,
Uh,
you may want to share your screen.
yeah, I'm in progress. Just a sec. Okay, I hope you see my screen, right?
Yep.
Cool. Okay, so there is a word that just keeps chasing me in almost every product or company I ever worked with. Velocity. You know, the word that just makes your product manager happy. Almost every team and every company I worked with was always trying to increase it. And just to be on the same page, velocity is the amount of the work items you complete within a specific time frame. So let's say a week. So if last week you've produced 4 features or 4 tasks, and this week you produced 6 features, it means that your velocity has increased and your product manager is happy. So you see that increasing velocity is actually a great wish because our market is so fast, and bringing more features can actually give us a huge competitive advantage in front of all of them. And in reality, we are all focusing on velocity, but that's not the only thing that we actually need. What we really need is to achieve both velocity, higher velocity, without actually losing quality. So today I want to share a few words about our story and about the way we are working with it. And I hope that I will answer the questions that you have, and feel free, please, to let anything that you have in the channel or later in the Slack. And first, I will introduce myself a bit. Hi, my name is Yevheniia. I'm a QA guild leader in Wix. And my main responsibility right now is to help 30 big teams to switch from one approach to another. I will share it in a few minutes. Another thing, I'm an authorized IC Agile instructor in Agile testing, helping and training people around the world with Agile testing. I'm a founder of Alpha IT School, where we educate QAs at different levels. And also, I recently started to be a global ambassador at Women Tech Network, helping every woman to join this amazing network where we share our ideas and like into some interesting community. You can find me in my Instagram or my LinkedIn account. I'm super open to any questions that you will have after the session. So I hope that you will enjoy it. In today's talk, I want to share our story about the reason why we actually decided to switch from fully QA-based automation to developers writing end-to-end tests. I will share why we actually started to do that. I will share what were the benefits that we expected to achieve, and of course, the challenges that we've met on the way. And eventually, in some time, we've built some tips and tricks that help us to make this approach actually work for us. And this talk name might sound like it is only for developers, and why I'm saying about all these things and actually testing conference. But I think we will all agree that quality is not already about the QA engineer only. It's about the whole team. And like I said before, using this approach was in order to achieve the goal of higher velocity and quality at the same time. You can do many things to go closer to the same, and this idea was one of our ways to achieve it. And a little promo for the end, then using such approach, you can either dramatically increase your velocity and without really losing quality, or you can kill both your velocity and the quality. And I hope that today's talk will encourage somebody to try it and will help you to avoid the challenges that we've met on our way. So as promised, a little story in the beginning. So once we started, we actually had tests. We had a lot of tests. Our developers mostly had a lot of lower level tests, like unit tests, component tests, integrations. So basically everything that is lower than UI or end-to-end. And they were writing them totally independently from QA engineers. On the other hand, we had QAs who were owning the most valuable level for us that actually found the most scary bugs. And they were also doing it completely independently on a different language, different framework, and they were doing it pretty much after the development was already done. So like I said, we had a lot of tests, but in this approach, we've realized that we have many gaps that doesn't allow us to complete the velocities that we wanted to achieve. So one of the gaps that we had in this approach is that, like I said before, the most valuable level was owned completely by QA. So in order for developer to basically get feedback from this valuable level, what he needed to do, he needed to complete the feature, he needed to ask your engineer to run those tests or even to write those tests, or sometimes to skip them because we don't have time and do the manual work, and only afterwards to get the feedback about bugs that exist in his code. And I think you all know the story because once he asked or he just sent this feature to QA and he's coming back with the tests written, in this case, developers already working with some different feature and focusing on some different issue, and now he needs to switch back, we need to wait. So we've spent so much time on this ping pong, and developers didn't really have a feeling of the ownership on a good code. They were just doing something a bit blindly, giving it to QA and then receiving some unexpected feedback. Another gap that we have is related to our ratio between developers and QA engineers in Wix. Our usual ratio is about 10 developers to 1 QA. And I think you already understand what does it mean. Then 10 developers are producing 10 features, and there is only one tiny QA engineer that needs to do all the work related to quality in terms of these 10 features. And you see that we've created a pretty big bottleneck in this case, or either we needed to just skip the test writing if we didn't have time. So because of such difference in terms of resources, we had the most valuable tests and pretty comprehensive task in the QA where we had less resources, and it created a bottleneck for us. So in order to overcome these gaps that actually stopped us from delivering faster, we decided that what we can try is to move the end-to-end testing level to developers to fully own it and maintain it. This approach is pretty used by many big companies, and especially the companies that share the mindset that developers must test their code, and they spend a lot of time and a lot of effort, a lot of education around developers writing end-to-end tests. And we decided that we can try something like this. And once we tried to think about such approach, of course, we expected to receive some cool things, not just the velocity. So the first benefit that we expected to get was actually to get the testable code. Because once I think it's it's a well-used approach called TDD or BDD, where we write the test first, and only then we create the code. And this approach is pretty good because first we think about how this feature should actually work, how it should be used, and how to make the code as good so the test will eventually pass. So if developers are somehow at least thinking, or even better, writing the tests, they're thinking about creating some testable code that will be easy to test eventually. And testable code, of course, leads us to less bugs in the end. The second benefit that we're willing to achieve was, of course, to provide a fast feedback loop for developers. Like I said before, once we had the end-to-end fully owned by QA engineers, developers needed to wait for the feedback from the most valuable level. And if we ask developers to write end-to-end tests and to run those end-to-end tests, of course, they will have a lot faster feedback loop. And they will be able to just change the code or add some new feature, run the test, and in a few minutes, just get the answer if they have bugs or not, without even calling for QA engineer. So eventually they would have bugs that are fixed without even QA knowing about it, without even texting him about it or something like this. So fast feedback loop was another thing that we wanted to achieve. And the last one is, of course, to shift QA left, because we understood that once we are finding bugs pretty late, and those bugs cost us money and time in order to fix them, to understand the expected behavior and such. We just kill our velocity, you make it slower, we deliver slower. So we were willing to shift the QA left, and to avoid the bottlenecks that we had, to remove this one only QA who was writing all the tests and doing all the manual work. Of course, all the benefits sound amazing, and we're super active to start, and we were expected that these two things will bring us velocity and quality. And I would actually lie if I would say that there were no challenges on our way. So once we decided and completed all the list of benefits we want to get, we came to different roles to talk to them. And the first audience that we actually talked to was the product managers. So we decided that we need to talk with them first, so they will give us some time. They will give developers time to write tests, and we expected that they will share our opinion about the benefits of the approach, and they will be super also proactive about doing the same. So we came and said, hello guys and girls, developers will now write end-to-end tests. So the only thing that management actually heard was developers will implement less features right now. And it might sound like something super opposite from increasing your velocity, right? How we can increase velocity if we will be producing less features. But this is not actually true. And the next thing we did, we needed to explain our product managers that such an approach can actually allow you eventually to deliver faster than if you have no tests written by developers. So if you will want to explain something like this to your managers, you can do it the same way. We just made a list of the things where we will spend more time and some things where we'll spend less. So that's totally right that we will need to spend some time on designing scenarios, so we will know what to cover. And it is totally right that eventually developers will write code and tests, and it will spend more time than just only writing the code. That's true. But also, you need to remember that you will reduce the amount of the testing done by QA engineer. You will reduce time spent on fixing the bugs. You will reduce the time spent on retesting because you don't actually create those bugs, or at least you create a lot less of them. At the same time, you create less automation in QA. And as you remember, we had pretty much a bottleneck there. You will spend less time on regression testing because all your regression will be automated, and regression testing will be basically done during the development, and QA will not even know about it. And of course, regression bug fixing will be a lot less because you also prevent those bugs. And all these things are basically showing you that, yes, you spend more time of the developer to write some tests, but eventually you don't produce technical debt. You don't create some bugs that you need to test, you need to fix and retest afterwards. And eventually all those things combined are your velocity. So if you sum and try to think about some hours, you will see that eventually you spend less time on the feature delivery because you produce less technical debt. And probably the most powerful thing, that you will spend a lot less time on waiting. Like I said before, we needed to wait for QA engineer to write some tests and to give feedback to developer needed to come back and such. So all this time spent on waiting basically was reduced because now this whole cycle happened inside of only developer hands. And once we started explaining it in hours and such things, um, project managers became more positive about it, and we decided to try. So the next audience we came to talk to was, of course, our hands developers, who were the people to write those tests. And developers were actually pretty okay with that. We have kind of like a culture in our company to test the code, to write tests. And that's why developers were okay with that. Product managers were also okay with that. So they give time for developers to do it. And we actually started. And in some time, we've realized that developers, they saw the value of the test, but actually the reality was that they love to write new features, not tests. It doesn't mean that they haven't seen the value in those tests. They totally knew that writing those tests will reduce the technical debt. It will make the changes eventually easier for them, but still, it doesn't mean that they like to do that. And another thing that we realized in some time, that usually they're not also really good at it, which also doesn't bring any motivation to do more tests. Because usually when we ask developers to write some tests, developers who are actually used to some complicated features implementation for millions of users, and now you ask them to write some super easy things like some easy waiters and understandable test names, it is not the easiest thing for them. And sometimes this test can end up with a rocket science or with some workarounds that does not make this test really good. And both of these things, no motivation and knowledge, leads to flaky tests that you cannot trust. So in honestly, in some time, we've ended up with many tests written. Of course, not in all cases, but some of those tests were really flaky and we couldn't trust those tests. And I think you all know what flag test means. It just kills all the good motives for writing automation for developers soon. Because once developer sees flag test, he doesn't understand why it's failing. He doesn't understand why his build is red again. He can't release a feature when there is no bug or no reason for it, and it creates a horrible experience around automation. So next time when you will be asking them to write more end-to-end tests, they will never be positive about it because they will imagine hours of debugging of some specific test to eventually find out that it is not even their bug. It could have been some flaky test on some other person's bug, and you end up with developers who just hate to write end-to-end tests. So all good intentions killed. And doing such thing with the flaky test and no motivation in developer hands, you can end up with really killing your velocity, both with quality. Because flaky tests are the real velocity killers. With flaky tests, you spend more times on debugging, you spend more time on understanding the issue, you spend more time on fixing the test, and you have no trust. So eventually you will still need to do some manual work with the same scenario because you just don't trust your test. And eventually your project manager will be right. You will spend more time and your velocity will be never increased. So since we don't want this to happen, I've prepared some tips that we will share in a few minutes later. But now about the next audience that we talked about. Next audience we talked to was actually QA engineers. So like I said before, developers were pretty positive about it. And on the other hand, QAs were not really positive about it. They were actually frustrated. For QA engineer who wrote all the automation before, it really sounded like a step back, and they thought that they will never write end-to-end tests anymore. They will become manual QA engineers forever, and like they will be technical less, and developers will be doing all the interesting job. But in this case, we needed to explain that this is actually not true, because such an approach can and have become the improvement, the evolution of our QA engineers and the whole QA process. So, as promised, I wanted to say that these challenges are something that I've met with almost all the teams that we worked with. Sometimes a bit better, sometimes a bit worse, but still the trend was the same. Developers were not that positive about writing end-to-end tests, they were not that good at it, and QA engineers were pretty frustrated about such a change. So we needed to create some tips that helped us to overcome those challenges and to achieve the goals that I've shared in the beginning, to bring velocity and both quality. So the first thing is once we gave the end-to-end testing level completely to developers and we realized that they are not really good at it, we understood that the best thing we can do for them is to design coverage. I think we all know that developers are not the professional QA analysts. It's just not their responsibility, not something they were taught how to do correctly. So if you just send them a task to create an end-to-end coverage for some specific feature, you might be pretty surprised about the things that are covered there. You might be not that satisfied about the coverage that exists, and in order to avoid such situation, in order to keep the quality and control it, what you can do, you can design a coverage for them. So the first thing, once you are developing a coverage for developers, I mean not writing tests, preparing scenarios for them, it is always a good thing because you produce a lot of conversation and discussion around your test scenarios prior to the development, also leads to the testable code. But thing to keep in mind is that you always need to design your scenarios according to the development process. What we've realized on the go is that the way QAs wrote their tests in their framework is something that will not definitely work inside of the build time where developers will need to write it and run it. And it didn't really fit the model where the tests should have blocked the build for developers to give them fast feedback. Because once QA engineers are writing something just for themselves, it's definitely one approach. And once you need to write something that will fit the high pace of the development, it's something different. So we realized that we need to do short and focused end-to-end tests. On the one hand, it might sound like end-to-end is something pretty big, user actions, a lot of steps and something like this. But in reality, if you keep your end-to-end tests short and focused, doing some specific scenario or some specific user action, doing some specific hypothesis, like you think that this feature will work this way, in this case, you create a test that will really help to find a bug for your developer. Because I've heard one cool thing recently that tests, we always care about our users, and tests should help us to not just to find the bug, but also to fix the bug. Shorter end-to-end tests focused on some specific feature really help us to find these exact bugs in this feature. And if you have a really long test that touches many features and doing many stuff, first, it can become flaky. Second thing, it will really, really increase your time of the debugging to find the cause of the issue. And since we want this bug to be fixed eventually, then in this case, we would really want to make it faster. The next thing is always when you're developing a test scenario for developers to keep your environment in mind. So by environment, I mean the circumstances that can affect your test. Usually QA engineer is the person who looks at the system view on the whole things that you have, on the whole system you have, on all the features. And usually QA engineer is the one who knows about some things that can actually make this feature work or that can affect your test. In my case, one of the examples is that we are running many tests in parallel, like thousands and like 10,000s of tests in parallel. So we need to make sure that we design those tests 100% independent, so they will not affect each other. Because if such tests affect each other, I think you understand that developer will not really see the exact reason for that, because it's going to be not some easy mistake in the test to identify. It is going to be some other test that changed the state of some specific feature you tested and affected this specific test. And there is really no clear reason for that. So it really, again, creates a lot of time for debugging and to understanding the issue. Another example that I can give is that we test on production only, and we have features to be turned on for our users as feature toggles. So if we want to show some feature only to QA engineers and not to show it to our users, we can use some feature toggle for testing. And basically, you can just forget to add some specific feature toggle, and you can end up with your test failing without a super clear reason for that. You will need to go to look into those test results to see what happened, and then you will realize that you just don't have this feature on. So such things really needs to be kept in mind, because once you develop tests, like design scenarios for your developers, you need them to work as smooth as possible and to reduce the time of the debugging that they will have. And the last thing, of course, is to actually improve the coverage. Once you ask developers to write tests, they focus mostly on the feature you're developing right now. So once they are implementing Google search, they will focus on Google search. And once you produce so many features, like hundreds of features, you will have a huge suite, like with hundreds of tests, with thousands of tests. And there should be some person who will look into those suite and make sure that it is improved on a go. Because once you're developing your test scenarios, you're making a hypothesis that this specific scenario will actually find a bug for you. But sometimes it doesn't. And it doesn't mean that you have bad tests. It just means that your hypothesis didn't work that way. And it just means that you need to understand the issues that you have in your production or that you found during some exploratory testing afterwards. And you just need to improve the test. You always need to improve your coverage on a go. It's worth to analyze if you have some flaky tests or not, if you have some tests that are missing, if you have some tests that need to be resynced, and you just need to go there, refactor them, or create a task for your developers to improve those tests. But I believe this is some responsibility that should be taken by a QA engineer, and this is something that is definitely take some ownership. And in this case, developers will just focus on their ongoing features, and you will be responsible for improving the coverage on the go. The next thing we realized that we help developers a lot with designing the coverage, and it helped us really to control it. It helped us to understand how we can reduce the manual efforts, and it really, really saved us from some scary bugs in production. But in some time, we still realized that we have one tiny QAs and is designing all the things for these 10 developers. And in some cases, it was not that scalable. So we understood that we need to teach developers and to improve their skills. So eventually they can do the same things, analyzing the features, improving the coverage as we did. So also, it is worth always to educate developers about how to actually write good tests. And we are the experts here. So the first thing about teaching developers is to help them to build a strategy, to help them to build an action plan for every situation they will have inside of their test. So first thing, for example, what to do if their test fails? Like, what is the flow on how to understand if it's a regression or not? What to do if it's actually not a bug in your code? Should we skip the test, or should be some other steps done in order to overcome the situation? But basically, if you don't want to end up with all your tests skipped or ignored or something like this, it's better to create a process for all such situations and actually to improve, to avoid the improvisation. And once you create a set of policies like this, you will see that you have it more controlled and your developers will feel more responsible, and you will have less skipped bugs that are not being run eventually. Another thing is, of course, to create best practices. We've started, like I said before, with developers just writing some tests. And in some time, we've realized that we have many different approaches and different teams working with the same framework, with the same technologies, and testing basically the same stuff. So it was the place where we've understood that we need to create some best practices about the structure so we can share the code eventually. Some best practices to avoid flakiness, like how to do a good waiter, for example, to build some conventions, because like I said before, developers love to do complicated feature, but they are not always thinking about how to do it in the easiest way they can. So you can end up with some complicated names or functions or something like this. So that's why you just need to create those practices. And the best way to find the place for those practices is actually to review those tests. I believe that once you start to write, your developers will start to write those tests. You will be there to hold their hand and to help them grow step by step. Like I said, we are the experts there. We are the people who know how to do good code for automation. Or even if we don't, we can learn how to and then teach our developers. And because of that, we need to help them to create scenarios, like I said in the previous tip, and then to review the tests, what we ended up with, to see if we can improve some waiter, to see if we can create some process out of it, to see if we do some good practice that we can share or something like this. So eventually we will build up our good strategy around automation for developers by reviewing all those tests. And from what I've seen, usually developers are doing better and better every time, and you reduce the amount of the QA help that you had in the beginning every day. And eventually your developers will become more independent, and your QA can actually safely go to the vacation, and developers will create some good tests on a go. And the last thing, I've already told a few things about it, that developers usually are not positive about end-to-end tests because they had some bad experience before, because they already wrote some tests and they started to be flaky, and because they debugged some tests for a long time and eventually they found out that it is some other team's bug. And such situations just create a horrible reputation for whole end-to-end automation. So if you have such case, and we had in such teams, we understood that we just need to change their mindset. And we found a few things that helped us to change it. The first thing is actually to build a trust with one good test. If you ever saw the developer who works with automation a lot, you can see how confident he is about doing some changes in his code. He just changes it, he checks the test results, and he is super okay. He understands that his code is fine, or he finds a bug really fast and he can fix it. But if you've also seen developer without any tests working on big project, you will see how scared he can be sometimes to do some change because it can break something super unexpected. And in order to make the second developer the first, you can start with one good test. Basically, if you have a lot of tests already and they're flaky and they're not helping you, just skip them all, refactor one good test, and give them to your developers. And let it run for a week or two or even a month. So your developer will see this green check and he will realize that his code is fine. It will create and build up day by day a feeling of a confidence about his code, and trust me, they will ask for more. Even those developers who are super opposite to this whole approach, once they had this one test they can trust, they ended up with asking for more. The next thing is about changing the mindset is you will really need to make it a habit. Once we've got the approval from the project managers and developers are pretty positive, it was just a matter of reminding them that we need to do such activity, because we are used to some high pace of the development. We usually work really fast. So once you just start doing all these things, you can just easily forget that during the development you needed to do some test writing. So in the beginning, you might need to become living reminders that end-to-end tests must be written as a definition of done for your task, and developers must do it. And you need to define it. You need to remind product managers that they need to save some time for developers to do it. And you need to remind developers that they need to just write those tests and send them for your review. It's I think it fits all the product changes, all the process changes once you do them. When people are not used to it, you really need to remind them that this is something that they need to do. And the last thing is something lovable for the managers is to actually show the value. Um, it's also worth to remember that automation starts to bring the value not only when you have 1000 tests. It starts to bring the value even with having one good test that you can trust. So once you have, I don't know, to have some beautiful numbers, maybe 10 tests that work good for you, try to find some KPIs that help you to show that this automation really brings value. Try to count how much time you spend less on testing, or you spend like less bugs you have in production, something like this. You can find those KPIs and show the value of your automation on the go. It will motivate developers to write more tests, and it will really show your management that it's worth the effort. And it will be really worth the effort if you do it in the correct way. And it the name of the talk sounds like this is only for developers, but that's actually not true. So why I'm not talking about QA engineers almost at all in this talk? But actually, I think you already know the answer. The whole talk is kind of like a motivation for a QA engineer. And I actually believe that QA engineer is the person that can drive and lead and coordinate such a change inside of your team. Usually, QA thought that it will be something like a step back for them. And what they had before, they were just writing tests and they were pretty happy about it. They felt very technical and they felt like the owners of this thing. And now we removed this thing from them. And they thought that they will become manual QAs. But what happened in reality is that once we moved this pretty comprehensive and time consuming task from them and moved it to developers, it opened the space for a lot of new tasks that are actually a next level tasks that required our QAs to grow. So eventually you have more tasks, QA engineers have more tasks to create the strategy, which is something deeper you need to learn into. You need to deeper understand automation as a tool to increase your velocity and keep the quality. You really need to understand and dive deep into the abilities of your framework. You need to think about some processes. You need to think about review the tasks and finding some cool tips you can improve. At the same time, you spend less time on writing tests, so you will have more time to really explore your product. Because what we really saw before is that we didn't have enough time even to do some deeper testing because we needed to spend a lot of time on writing tests. And now we had more time to do real exploring and to find real business valuable bugs that were missing because we didn't just have time to find them. Another thing is that you will have time to create some good practices. You will have time to learn those best practices. You will learn how to do the monitoring and improve your coverage on the go. You will learn how to do the change management because this process actually requires you to become a little bit of a change manager. And at the same time, you can still continue writing tests. Some of the teams we worked with decided that for some specific features, they asked developers to do first priority tests and QAs to do the rest. In some cases, developers were owning all the tests that they had. But these things makes you really flexible. And if your QA engineer wants to still write some tests, just to write some tests, he can still do it. He can still find bugs or cases or some production incidents that you need to cover and you need to improve. He can still refactor those tests. He can still find the place where he can educate developers. He can still review their code. So all these tasks created a huge growth for our QA engineers and actually a big motivation to grow. And we've ended up with QA engineers who actually realized that this change is something that is an evolution for them other than a step back. And I really believe that QA engineer, QA leader, or actually any QA role probably because I'm a QA role, I believe that QA is the best driver, the best motivator for such change. And if he does it correctly, it can really, really help to increase your velocity without losing quality. And to sum it up, some key takeaways. If you decide to try such an approach to move your end-to-end tests to developers, it doesn't mean that you will need to write less features. Eventually, if you count all the times that you will spend on writing code versus time you will save on waiting or fixing bugs or retesting, you will find out that you can actually deliver more features, not less. Also, you need to remember that sometimes if you just ask developers to do end-to-end tests, they can do some not perfect end-to-end tests. So you just need to keep it in mind and invest into educating them and reviewing their tasks. Also, QA engineers should be there to help, to coordinate, because automation is the tool that is totally needed to reduce the manual work. And it is definitely something that QA should know about and QA should control. I believe that QA should be a coordinator of this thing, and QA should start this communication once it just goes to requirements about how we can automate this feature. And in order to help your developers, you can design coverage for them because we are the QA analysts there. You can help them to grow their skills. And if they have a bad mindset about the bad opinion about automation, you can change it step by step. So what is the trick? How to make developers love writing tests? It is actually about not trying to make them love it. It is about helping them. It is about designing coverage for them and just letting them do what they really love to do, to write the code. Thank you, guys.